A frightening, unknown deadly virus caused a lockdown of a vast area, leaving 4,000 people isolated without access to food, medicine, or communication. Day 13. The National Guard of the USA, fully geared up, stands ready for orders. Upon receiving the command, the gates open, and they move out onto the street. They encounter crowds of people wearing medical masks, who resist and plead for assistance. The situation quickly spirals into chaos and lawlessness on the street. After dispersing the crowd, the soldiers retreat behind the gates and close them, restoring order temporarily. Day 1. A school bus arrives at Atlanta City Hospital with children and their teacher. At the entrance, the kids encounter a man with rats in cages. Meanwhile, Dr. Sanders, severely ill, sits isolated in a room. Another doctor, standing behind glass, asks her to recount what happened. She explains that she had just started her rounds and hadn't seen the initial patients yet. Following them was a Syrian man who was very sick, though she didn't have direct contact with him. Recognizing his severe condition, she tried to catch up with him to convince him to stay for observation, but he refused. Reflecting on the events, she recalls giving him her pen to sign a form and realizes she got infected through it. In another part of the city, a woman packs her belongings into a box in her room when a man enters with a cup of coffee. Sensing her reluctance to move in with him, he notices her demeanor and apologizes for any doubts she may have. Frustrated, he leaves and vents to his friend outside that she won't be coming, she's not moving in. Just then, his phone rings, summoning him to an urgent meeting at the health department. Arriving at the meeting, his boss announces they've gathered due to a flu outbreak. A large screen displays Dr. Connors from the CDC discussing the Syrian man with fake documents who is infected. The meeting head orders the police to locate and bring him to the hospital, with Major Alex Carnier appointed as lead. Just then, Sabina Lammers from the Ministry of Health and Welfare enters, takes attendance, and warns of an impending epidemic. Meanwhile, Jana rides her bike past a convenience store where she spots a pregnant girl entering with her mother, who allows her a brief 15-minute break. Outside, Teresa meets her boyfriend in the backyard. He's glad to see her and shares plans for their escape, though she asks to delay slightly to assist her mother. Dr. Connors details the symptoms of the patient, emphasizing the virus's rapid spread and identifying the Syrian man as patient 0. 3 more people, all in contact with Dr. Sanders, have shown symptoms, indicating the virus spreads through physical contact. Connors recommends locking down the hospital until they confirm the Syrian man as the initial carrier. The major inquires about the virus's identity, but Lammers states it remains unidentified. Meanwhile, isolated in her room, Dr. Sanders struggles with severe symptoms, choking on her own blood. In another area of Atlanta City Hospital, children perform under their teacher's guidance for the patients. Dr. Carver informs the teacher that he'll take over the tour in Sanders' absence, as she has gone missing. After his call with Jana, Alex's friend expresses frustration, feeling unappreciated despite their connection. Moments later, he's approached by the major, who appoints him as lead to locate the infected Syrian man and bring him to the hospital. Following the hospital tour, the teacher counts the children on the bus when one girl sneezes. They prepare to depart, but a hospital doctor stops them, ordering them to stay. He emphasizes the need to avoid physical contact and maintain a 2-meter distance. Meanwhile, Jana surprises her friend at work, who assumes she had the day off. She hands her belongings to Susie and heads to her office, where she ignores a call from Lex despite her friends urging to answer. At Atlanta City Hall, the major meets with Lammers, who urges him to act as a representative for the people due to their mistrust of authorities. Despite his 12 years in the police force earning trust, he seeks the complete truth, knowing it won't come easily. Lammers discloses the severity of the virus, unprecedented in her experience, warning of potentially catastrophic consequences if it isn't contained. Meanwhile, Susie tries reaching Jana, but Lex calls again. This time, Jana answers and learns of a developing situation near her at the hospital, possibly an epidemic. Concerned, Lex suggests Jana move in with him temporarily, which prompts Jana to express her love and agree to make the move permanent. Back at the hospital, the school director contacts the teacher, revealing they've been locked down without explanation, with one girl taken for examination. Simultaneously, the man who brought rats to the hospital calls his granddaughter Teresa, asking for help with her grandmother. Teresa, at the station with a suitcase, sighs heavily and informs her boyfriend Xander that she'll be delayed. She insists he proceed without her, as she plans to catch up later. Jake and another police officer, accompanied by an epidemiologist, arrive at the Syrian's house wearing protective gear. The family reacts with distress, but they manage to bring them all to the hospital safely. At the hospital, Miss Katie Frank is approached by a student who invites her to see the rats, but she declines. The student reveals that Quentin and Thomas went to see the rats on their own, prompting Katie to immediately search for them. Jake delivers the Syrian and his family to the hospital, where they are isolated and undergo examination. After briefing the doctor, the police officer prepares to leave for the station, but the doctor insists he stay for safety. During their conversation, Katie approaches, seeking the two boys who went to see the rats. Her attention shifts to a visibly sick young man, unsettling her. He offers to assist, and together they explore the hospital corridors, eventually discovering the bodies of a man and a woman in a closed laboratory room, clearly victims of the virus. At the meeting, Dr. Connors reported on patient 0, whose condition had worsened and who unfortunately passed away. Additionally, other relatives are beginning to exhibit symptoms. Dr. Connors concluded that the virus is highly contagious and poses a significant risk to patients. Quentin and Thomas, along with a man, are inspecting the rats when Katie and Jake find them. The adults scold the boys and escort them out of the laboratory. In the corridor, the young man and woman introduce themselves briefly before a doctor interrupts with urgent news. The hospital is being placed under quarantine for 48 hours. Meanwhile, at a meeting, Lammers reveals that Dr. Connors has identified the virus as a hybrid of type A influenza and avian flu, a genetically modified strain. Traces of this virus were found in a vial among the Syrian's belongings, suggesting he imported it and inadvertently triggered the outbreak by infecting Dr. Sanders. Concerned about bioterrorism, Lammers declares the case now falls under national security jurisdiction, emphasizing the need for stringent security measures to contain the virus. Elsewhere, Teresa waits at the train station for her commuter train. When it arrives, it unexpectedly departs without allowing passengers to board. Station staff instruct everyone to evacuate as the station is closed, likely due to the unfolding health crisis. Lex calls Jana urgently, leaving a voicemail advising her to skip going home for her things and to come directly to him because the situation is deteriorating rapidly. Just then, Jake calls Lex, furious and trapped in the hospital amidst a dire situation. He describes the isolation units as chaotic nightmares. After this intense conversation, the Major meets with Lammers and agrees to act as her representative to gain access to critical information. Lammers explains they are establishing a quarantine zone to contain the virus, isolating one area from the surrounding districts to prevent further spread. By evening, the barricade was erected, effectively dividing the population, causing widespread dissatisfaction among those unable to return home. At a press conference, Lammers defends the quarantine as a necessary measure and reassures the public that authorities are doing everything possible to contain the threat. Meanwhile, Teresa, unable to leave due to the quarantine, calls her boyfriend. Police vehicles pass by, broadcasting instructions over loudspeakers for people to stay home, maintain distance, and comply with directives. Xander advises Teresa to return to the store where he will pick her up later. Sabina specifies during the press conference that the quarantine will last only 2 days and outlines the restricted areas while canceling and prohibiting large gatherings. Teresa quietly returns to her mother, who is absorbed in watching the news, oblivious to the suitcase in her daughter's hands. In the hospital, the stranded children under Katie and Jake's care prepare for sleep, while the man takes a moment to call his wife to check on her well-being. Outside the barricade, police continue to manage frustrated crowds with limited success. Suddenly, the Major spots Jana just beyond the barricade. He tries to shout to her, but she doesn't hear him as she's wearing headphones. Workers activate the electric fence, causing cries to echo. Lex turns around to witness his subordinate restraining a man attempting to climb over the barricade. The Major intervenes, releasing the man after obtaining his promise not to attempt it again. Amidst the chaos outside, disorder reigns as military personnel engage in conflicts with infected individuals. Night 1. At the morgue, the pathologist conducts an autopsy on a Syrian individual. Lammers addresses those assembled, emphasizing the absence of a vaccine for the virus and its 100% mortality rate among carriers. However, she reassures them that all contacts have been traced, and they believe the virus has not spread locally. Lammers requests detailed reports from all official personnel. During the autopsy, the doctor determines that the time from infection to death is less than 48 hours, underscoring the rapid progression of the virus. Nearby, journalists gather near the quarantine zone border, where police work to manage crowds and push the press beyond the perimeter. Major Leo Green is approached by a man who shows him a video depicting a tense encounter involving a black man and a white policeman. The man intervenes to defuse the situation but is asked by the black man to leave him alone. Meanwhile, Jana calls Lex, updating him on the quarantine zone and the escalating crisis, urging her to stay in the office for safety. She mentions that Jake is also inside the zone and can be contacted if needed. Lex attempts to call a friend for support, but his friend declines to answer the phone. Teresa engages in a video call with Xander when Emmy interrupts, inviting her to a party where a friend's parents are away and they've organized a gathering. Meanwhile, Jana settles into her office, but unexpectedly Susie and Dennis arrive. She's frustrated that her friend didn't go home and was out with the boss. In another part of the city, the Major issues instructions to his subordinates while a white car arrives at a house. A visibly unwell girl steps out. In the city hospital, Miss Katie educates her students about viruses and quarantine procedures. After watching the video with Lex, Lammers is convinced she made the right choice in selecting him. However, she worries about Lex's girlfriend being confined in the quarantine zone, as well as his friend Jake. Lex reassures her that he won't neglect his responsibilities. Lammers introduces the mayor to Dr. Connors, who updates them on the current number of people in quarantine and confirms that Jake's friend is not infected. Jana and her friend inspect the refrigerator and find it nearly empty. At that moment, their colleague Tony arrives at the office. Meanwhile, Jake receives a call from his upset friend. Lex informs him that Jana is also in quarantine. While they talk, Jake searches through the belongings of the Syrian relatives and discovers a photo of a girl on one of their phones, taken after they were already infected. Later, the major returns to the police department and instructs them to locate and monitor the movements of this girl. Meanwhile, Jake attempts to extract the name of the girl from a teenager, who remains silent. One of the relatives mentions that he never spoke about her, as they wouldn't have approved. Elsewhere, Emmy approaches Teresa and kisses her on the cheek. She invites Teresa to leave the store for a party, but Teresa hesitates. On the street, Leo approaches Lex wanting to know more details, but Lex refuses to divulge anything. The journalist then remarks that he thought the major was different from the others and doesn't know the whole truth. His friend from security services informs them that neither Syria nor ISIS have claimed responsibility for what happened, indicating it's not bioterrorism. Just then, a subordinate police officer calls out to them. They've found the address of the girl, located outside the quarantine zone. Arriving at the address, they find the girl's anxious parents who don't know where their daughter is. She never returned home. Back in the office, Lex continues his search. Reviewing camera footage, they locate the car she got into and trace her movements completely. Near one of the buildings, she exits the car and enters a house. Based on the timing, it appears the girl remained within the quarantine zone. Nevertheless, if she's infected, it's still very dangerous as the virus could spread throughout the district. After switching the cameras to real-time mode, they observe the car still parked outside the house. Since Lammers hasn't authorized sending an external team, Lex calls Jake once more and requests him to visit the house for a check. He instructs Jake to wear full protective gear and bring medics along. Jake reluctantly accepts the assignment. Katie watches the news in the doctor's office, curious about who will discharge them after the 48 hours. She notices on TV that the Syrian died earlier than others, despite seeing 2 deceased individuals in the old wing while he was still alive. The doctor reassures her, explaining that people have varying immune responses, and the young man simply held on longer. Meanwhile, Jake arrives at the house where the girl is suspected to be. Upon entering, he discovers numerous teenagers, and in one of the rooms, he finds her. She has been infected with the virus. Teresa visits her grandmother, bringing groceries. After preparing a plate for her, she's about to serve it when she sees news about infected teenagers, including her friend Emmy. Startled, she swiftly discards the food, washes the dishes, and rushes out, citing a mistake in her shopping. Meanwhile, Jake reports to the major that approximately 30 people were at the house, engaged in a game of spin the bottle. It's unclear how many became infected, as the virus spreads rapidly. Despite his friend's attempts to reassure him that their technology will track down and contain the disease, Jake becomes agitated after speaking with Lex. In a fit of anger, he throws his helmet and punches a wall. Hearing the commotion, Katie arrives and confronts him, noting that even the quarantined children in the hospital behave better than he does. Lex and Lammers speak with Dr. Connors, who reports that the number of infected individuals has risen, and the initial cases have already resulted in deaths. School children, including Emmy, have been relocated to an isolation ward. Walking through the corridors, Emmy witnesses others succumbing to the virus. Upon entering a room with another infected girl, she starts to panic. Lammers discusses with the major the challenge of tracking everyone until the virus subsides, making it impossible to lift the quarantine. Lex grasps the situation and inquires about evacuating healthy individuals. Observing Lammers' reaction, he realizes they cannot evacuate anyone. The quarantine will remain enforced with no one allowed to leave or enter. Dr. Connors informs Katie that parents can pick up their children tomorrow. The quarantine is lifted at the hospital but remains in effect citywide, as the virus has spread beyond its borders. Katie realizes she will need to remain at the hospital, as her home is outside the quarantine zone. In a state of hysteria, Teresa calls Xander, fearing she may have been infected after Emmy kissed her on the cheek. Xander tries to reassure her and promises to come to her. Jana and Susie sit in the office chatting when they are startled by a commotion outside. They rush to the window and see a 3-story barrier of containers being erected on the street, completely blocking off the neighborhood from any entry or exit. Along the fence, more containers are being installed, escalating the fear among people who plead desperately to be allowed out. To prevent any chance of infiltration into the quarantine zone, workers begin welding shut the sewer manholes. At the CDC, Lammers gives an interview where she explains the challenges in containing the virus, leading to a small group of infections that necessitates extending the quarantine. Additional cargo containers are being added to reinforce the perimeter. Journalists are particularly focused on identifying patient 0, with no country taking responsibility. There are concerns about potential discrimination against Muslims in the zone. Leo Green's publications are seen as exacerbating tensions. Lammers emphasizes their commitment to protecting those in quarantine and criticizes Mr. Green for fueling fear and paranoia. After addressing questions, she invites Lex to speak. He reassures everyone that if they all adhere to the guidelines and support each other, the situation will improve soon. In the hospital, Dr. Connertz and other doctors triage incoming patients, swiftly isolating those obviously infected into special wards. Meanwhile, Bert urgently requests rats for experimental research aimed at understanding treatment options or developing a vaccine. The doctor, after speaking with Bert, turns to Jake for assistance. The quarantine ward is overwhelmed, and they're rapidly running out of space. Despite efforts to convert other departments, it's still insufficient. Descending to the lower levels, they reach the crematorium, which is filled with bodies. The doctor explains that the deceased are no longer infectious, as the virus typically dies within 2 hours after death. However, leaving the bodies unattended poses a risk of other disease outbreaks. He assigns a police officer the task of cremating the bodies to mitigate this risk. Jana calls Lex, frustrated that he hasn't shared any information with her. Lex explains it's classified and uncertain how long the quarantine will last. The virus has spread beyond the hospital, posing a widespread threat. He advises her to stay put, avoid going out, and ration food due to limited police presence in their area. Meanwhile, near Lammer's office, she meets with the major. She believes Leo Green must be silenced as his reports are causing panic and undermining authority. Lex suggests deploying 50 police officers, but she declines, opting instead to silence the journalist directly. At the hospital, parents retrieve their children, but Mary, Thomas, and their son Quentin choose to stay with Katie. Leo video calls his friends inside the quarantine zone, who show him a video of their house gate marked with a biohazard sign, the place where the teens were infected. Their conversation is interrupted by a knock on the door. It's Lex, prompting Leo to end the call. The major asks Lex to halt his video posts to prevent escalating tensions, but Lex insists on uncovering the truth. His friend from Homeland Security reassures him it's not terrorism related. Lammers claims all infected individuals are identified, but friends from the zone report death marks everywhere. Lex is torn between conflicting accounts and feels frustrated, believing he's wasting time trying to persuade them. As he prepares to leave, a crucial question arises. What if someone manages to escape the zone? Will they be shot? Major Lex approaches Lammers with a plan to send police officers into the quarantine zone. At that moment, she watches a video on Leo Green's channel where his request for access has been denied. The video grimly shows streets filled with bodies due to the virus. Meanwhile, Jake is busy in the crematorium, organizing documents and personal items. Lex calls him, delivering the disappointing news. There will be no reinforcements, only 11 police officers for the entire zone, and they must manage on their own. Reluctantly, the major appoints Jake as their leader, a responsibility he reluctantly accepts. Jana divides the dwindling food supplies among everyone, but the portions are meager. They are forced to ration carefully, uncertain of how long the quarantine will last. Dennis suggests venturing out for more supplies, with support from Tony and Susie. Teresa video calls Xander from the storeroom, worried she might have been infected. Their conversation is interrupted by an argument between a customer and her mother, who is upset over rising prices. At the hospital, children are becoming restless. The driver suggests going to the roof for fresh air. Up there, Thomas approaches Katie, urgently needing to use the restroom. Unable to wait for a teacher, he runs ahead. Katie chases after him, and on the stairs, they encounter an infected man. During the encounter, Thomas gets blood from the infected on him and is immediately placed in quarantine. It's uncertain if he's infected. His father was supposed to pick him up that evening. Dennis and Tony bring food to the office, but Jana notices that their boss isn't wearing gloves. Concerned about safety, she refuses to let them in, leading to Dennis and Tony being placed in quarantine for 48 hours. Meanwhile, Teresa continues her conversation with Xander in the storeroom. She hears commotion again in the store and looks out the window to see a disgruntled customer with several armed men. They threaten her mother and begin looting the store. Teresa tries to call 911, but the lines are overloaded. Luckily, Jake and his partner happen to be nearby and intervene, forcing the robbers to return the stolen goods and leave the store. Lex attempts once more to persuade Lammers to send police officers, proposing a new plan. However, she remains adamant and denies permission again. Meanwhile, Katie notices Thomas is missing from his room. She tracks him down in the hallway with his father, who has decided to take him away. Katie and Dr. Connertz try to convince the man to leave Thomas in quarantine, but he becomes confrontational and pulls out a gun, insisting on taking his child away. Leo video calls his friends, who share footage revealing a fire escape on a building where people can potentially jump onto containers and escape the quarantine zone. They urge Leo to publish the video so the police can block the escape route, but Leo insists on revealing the truth to the public. He suggests they escape themselves, but the women refuse, expressing hesitation. In the midst of their discussion, one of them sneezes, raising concerns about potential infection. Jake arrives at the container gate and finds Lex already inside, bringing along weapons, ammunition, gloves, and gear. Jake expresses frustration that Lex came alone, feeling they are understaffed for the task. Meanwhile, the Major receives urgent news. Leo has publicly disclosed a way to escape the quarantine. Police swiftly locate the escape route and move to secure it. Jake's team is tasked with holding back the approaching crowd while Lex's group dismantles the ladder used for escape. Despite warnings, one individual manages to breach the perimeter and reaches the containers. Ignoring commands to return to the quarantine zone, the situation escalates, leading to a police officer ultimately firing a shot at the intruder. Jana talks to Lex on the phone, Teresa connects with Xander via video, Leo discusses with his friends, and Dr. Connertz converses with other doctors. Suddenly, all communication and internet connections unexpectedly go down. In the doctor's office, the phone rings. He answers and learns that secure internet and phone access will be restored for him tomorrow, but communication remains cut off for everyone else in the quarantine zone. This concludes the third episode. Comment if you want more, share your thoughts, like the video, and subscribe to the channel. See you in the next videos.